You lost, boy. Officer Brian Davis's voice dripped with sarcasm as he circled the black man in the charcoal suit outside Maple County Courthouse. What's a man like you doing here looking for community service? The man said nothing. His briefcase hung steady at his side. Don't play dumb, Davis sneered. You don't work here. The man finally spoke, calm and steady. Actually, I do. Laughter broke out. Officer Mark Lee leaned against the patrol car, shaking his head. Sure you do. What are you, janitor of the month? Still, no reaction. Just that same calm face. It made them nervous. Turn around, Davis barked. Hands where I can see 'em. The man didn't move. His silence wasn't fear, it was something else. Something that made the air heavier. The cuffs clicked, cameras rolled, and the crowd whispered. 3 white officers, 1 black man. Outside the very courthouse where justice was supposed to live. They thought they were teaching him a lesson. But the real lesson, the one that would silence the whole department, was about to begin. The man's name was George Walker. He had parked in his usual spot near the courthouse steps, just as he had for the past 12 years. He was never late, never careless, and always dressed the same: a clean suit, polished shoes, and a silver watch his late father gave him. But this morning, as he reached for his briefcase, he noticed the new security guard eyeing him from the corner of the lot. A young white man, badge shining, hand resting near his radio. Sir, this is a restricted area, the guard said, voice tight. George stopped. I work here, he replied calmly. The guard frowned, scanning him from head to toe. You got proof? George opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, the guard's hand moved to his radio. Yeah, I got a male, mid-50s, black, suit and tie, refusing to identify. Might be trespassing. George blinked. Trespassing? The guard didn't answer. Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled in. 2 officers stepped out: Brian Davis and Mark Lee. Their boots hit the pavement hard. All right, what's the problem here? Davis asked. The guard pointed. He says he works here. No ID badge on him. George reached into his pocket slowly. I left it in my car. You can... Hands where I can see 'em, Davis snapped, stepping closer. George froze, palms up. Officer, there's no need for that. Davis smirked. There's always a need when someone like you gets smart. A few people walking by stopped to watch. The courthouse entrance loomed behind him, tall and white like a symbol mocking him. He could see the courtroom window from where he stood. His name was on that office door. But none of that mattered now. Turn around, Davis said again. You fit a description. George frowned softly. A description of what? Davis smiled. Of someone who doesn't belong. Mark Lee walked around behind him, shaking his head like this was some kind of game. You people never learn, huh? George's voice stayed low. You're making a mistake. Davis grabbed his wrist. I'll decide that. The cuffs snapped shut. Too tight. He felt the metal dig into his skin, but he didn't resist. He had seen too many men lose everything in moments like this. The louder you fight, the harder they push. On your knees, Davis ordered. George stared straight ahead. That won't be necessary. Mark Lee pressed down on his shoulder until he knelt. The concrete was rough under his knee. The laughter from the officers echoed around him, bouncing off the cars. Smile for the cameras, one of them said, noticing phones lifted in the crowd. George looked toward the courthouse again. He could see the faint reflection of the flagpole on the glass door. He took a slow breath. He had sworn an oath under that flag to defend justice, to protect the innocent, to hold every man accountable under the same law. Now, the same law was being used to humiliate him. Still, he said nothing. Officer Tom Reed, the youngest of the 3, stood by the car door, looking unsure. He had just joined the force 2 months ago. He kept glancing between his partners and George. Something in his chest didn't feel right. "Hey, Davis," he muttered. "Maybe we should check his ID first." Davis shot him a look. "You questioning me, rookie?" Tom swallowed hard. "No, sir. Just, maybe we should confirm before." "Shut it. Do your job." The guard laughed nervously, pretending not to see the discomfort. George finally spoke, voice calm but firm. "I hope your camera's working, officer, because one day you'll want to remember this." Davis leaned down close to his ear. "You threatening me?" George met his eyes, unflinching. "No, just making sure the truth doesn't get lost." The words hung in the air. Something in his tone made even Lee pause for a second. More people gathered. Cars slowed down. Someone shouted, "That's wrong!" from across the street. But Davis straightened, pretending not to hear. "Put him in the car." As they lifted George, the briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the ground. The latch popped open. Inside were neat folders, legal documents, and a small nameplate that read, "Honorable George Walker, Chief Judge, Maple County Courthouse." Tom Reed froze. His mouth fell open slightly. "Chief Judge?" he whispered. Davis looked down, then kicked the briefcase aside. "Fake. He's lying." George didn't protest. He just watched his briefcase slide into the dirt. The golden letters of his name glinted under the sun like quiet proof of who he really was. But no one wanted to see it. Not yet. They pushed him into the car. His wrists burned. The cuffs had cut through the skin now, small drops of blood smearing the metal. Inside the cruiser, George stared out the window at the courthouse. The building he had spent half his life in now looked distant and cold. Across the lot, courthouse clerk Linda White noticed the scene. Her eyes widened. "That's Judge Walker," she gasped, running toward the steps. But the car doors slammed shut. The siren started. As the cruiser pulled away, George's reflection flashed across the window. For a brief second, he saw himself calm, wounded, silent, and thought of his father's words. "Son, one day they'll test your dignity. Don't let them take it." The tires screeched. The crowd shouted. Cameras followed. And the man they mocked as a trespasser was driven away from his own courthouse, still silent, still composed, carrying a truth that was about to shake the entire city. The patrol car rolled down Main Street, its siren fading into the morning noise. Inside, George Walker sat quietly, his hands cuffed, his wrists sore. The two officers in the front kept talking as if he wasn't there. "Can you believe that?" Officer Brian Davis laughed. "Guy really tried to pull the judge card. Said he worked here." "What a clown." Mark Lee chuckled from the passenger seat. "He had that look, though. You know, the type suit too clean, smile too calm. Always think they're smarter than us." George said nothing. His gaze stayed fixed on the courthouse, growing smaller behind them. His briefcase still lay on the ground, papers scattered by the wind. The cuffs bit into his skin again when the car hit a bump. He didn't flinch. He had been insulted before, ignored before. But this was different. They were dragging him away from the very house of justice he had sworn to protect. He looked at his reflection in the window. His tie was crooked, his shirt collar stained with sweat, but his eyes were steady, calm, like someone watching a storm that he already knew how to end. Back at the courthouse steps, Linda White stood frozen, phone in hand. "That's Judge Walker," she kept saying, voice trembling. "They just took Judge Walker." The new security guard, David Clark, blinked in confusion. "What? That guy? You mean—" "Yes," Linda snapped. "The chief judge. The man who runs this courthouse." Clark's face went pale. He turned toward the parking lot, watching the police car vanish in traffic. His radio crackled, but he couldn't speak. The weight of what he had done pressed heavy on his chest. "Call Judge Scott," Linda shouted to another clerk. "Now! Tell her what happened." Inside, Judge Barbara Scott was in her chambers reviewing case files when the door burst open. "They arrested Judge Walker," a young intern gasped. "Right outside. Judge Scott's pen dropped from her hand. "What did you just say?" "They said he was trespassing. They cuffed him, ma'am." For a moment, she couldn't move. Then she grabbed her robe and keys. "Get the mayor on the line. I want every camera on that street." The police cruiser stopped at the edge of the station parking lot. Davis climbed out first, stretching his arms. "Another one for the books," he muttered. Mark Lee opened the back door. "Out!" he ordered. George stepped out slowly, blinking against the sunlight. A few officers nearby stopped talking when they saw him. There was something about his posture too calm, too sure. "Name?" one of the officers at the desk asked, as Davis pushed George forward. "Walker. George Walker," Davis said quickly. "Picked him up near the courthouse. Said he works there." The desk officer looked up. "Walker, huh? Any ID?" "Not on him," Davis replied. "But we'll find out who he really is soon enough." George looked straight at the officer behind the desk. "You already know who I am," he said softly. Davis rolled his eyes. "Save the act, man." The clerk at the corner of the room frowned. "Hold on. Did you say George Walker?" "Yeah. Why?" Davis asked. The clerk hesitated. "You mean Judge Walker?" Davis laughed harshly. "Judge? That's a good one." The clerk didn't laugh. He reached for the phone. "Stay here," he muttered, dialing fast. Within minutes, phones rang across the city. News alerts started pinging. By the time Davis realized something was off, it was already too late. At Maple County Courthouse, Judge Barbara Scott and Linda White rushed out of the building. Reporters were arriving, cameras flashing. "Ma'am," one officer outside stammered, "they already took him downtown." Judge Scott stopped dead. Her voice was sharp. "You arrested a sitting chief judge?" The officer swallowed. We didn't know." "Then you'd better learn to look beyond color," she said coldly. "Because ignorance is no excuse for humiliation." She turned to Linda. "Get me Commissioner Roberts. I want his car outside now." Within 10 minutes, a black SUV pulled up. The driver jumped out. "Commissioner Roberts sent me," he said. "Good," Judge Scott replied, stepping inside. "Take us to the station, and make sure the cameras follow." At the police station, the air had shifted. Davis leaned against the wall, trying to laugh it off. "Can't believe everyone's acting so uptight. He's just another loudmouth trying to play victim." Mark Lee looked less certain now. "Still, something feels off." That clerk looked like he saw a ghost. Before Davis could reply, the station doors swung open. Judge Barbara Scott entered, her black robe flowing behind her, followed by Commissioner John Roberts and Clerk Linda White. Cameras flashed as reporters crowded behind. Every conversation in the room died. "Where is he?" Judge Scott demanded. The desk officer pointed silently to the holding area. George was sitting on a bench inside, hands still cuffed, back straight. When he looked up, the room fell quiet. "George," Judge Scott said softly, her voice heavy with disbelief. He nodded once. "Barbara." Davis stepped forward, confused. You know him?" Judge Scott turned to face him. Her tone turned to ice. "Know him? Officer, you just assaulted and humiliated the chief judge of Maple County Courthouse." The words landed like thunder. Mark Lee's mouth fell open. Davis blinked, then laughed, nervously. "Wait, what?" "No, that's not—" But Linda White stepped forward, holding up her phone. The video of the arrest was already viral. Every word, every insult, every shove had been captured. The room erupted in whispers. "Chief Judge? That's him? Oh my God!" Commissioner Roberts spoke next, voice firm. "Uncuff him, now." Davis hesitated. "Sir, I said now." Davis fumbled for his keys, unlocking the cuffs with shaking hands. George rubbed his wrists gently, blood still fresh along the marks. He didn't shout, he didn't curse, he just looked at Davis. "You said I don't belong here," he said quietly. But I've spent my whole life in this building making sure justice belongs to everyone. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Commissioner Roberts turned to Davis. You and Lee, suspended effective immediately. Internal review begins today. Davis's face turned red. This is a misunderstanding. Then you can explain it under oath, Roberts said flatly. Outside, the news had already broken. Reporters filled the street, microphones flashing. Chief Judge arrested by his own police force, the headlines read. But George didn't speak to the cameras. He just stood on the courthouse steps beside Judge Scott, looking out at the crowd. The same people who had watched him humiliated were now cheering. Phones were still up, but this time they weren't recording shame, they were recording change. Linda touched his arm gently. Are you okay, sir? George nodded. No, but I will be. This isn't just about me. Judge Scott looked at him with quiet respect. What will you do now? He watched the crowd for a long moment. I'll start where they tried to end me inside that courthouse. He turned slowly toward the entrance, his wrists still sore, his dignity unbroken. The world had seen what happened. Now it was time for the system to see itself. The next morning, the courthouse was silent. No laughter, no chatter, no footsteps echoing in the marble halls. Only whispers heavy and nervous followed Chief Judge George Walker as he walked toward room B12, the same courtroom where hundreds of people had once stood before him seeking justice. Now, it was his turn to demand it. His wrists were still marked, thin red lines that told the story better than any speech could. He carried no anger in his face, just purpose. Behind him walked Judge Barbara Scott, Commissioner John Roberts, and a few city officials. The crowd outside chanted his name, holding signs that read, "Justice for the Judge," and "Accountability Now." Inside the room, the officers sat at a long table, Brian Davis, Mark Lee, and their attorney, Charles Baker, the police union president. Baker's gray suit looked too polished, his smile too calm. He leaned back in his chair as George entered, pretending to be unfazed. "Judge Walker," Baker said, voice oily. "This whole thing's gotten out of hand. A simple misunderstanding." George raised his hand slightly. "A misunderstanding doesn't leave blood on a man's wrist." The room fell still. Baker shifted in his seat but forced a smirk. "Our officers acted in good faith. They didn't recognize you. Surely you can understand." George interrupted softly. "You mean they didn't recognize my position? They recognized my color just fine." A low murmur ran through the room. Officer Davis folded his arms. "You think you're special because you wear that robe?" he said bitterly. "You're still just—" "Stop," Commissioner Roberts cut in sharply. "You've said enough." George didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm was louder than any shout. He opened a thin brown folder on the table. "I spent the last 12 years reviewing misconduct cases, Mr. Baker. Patterns, complaints, videos that never saw daylight." He slid a few papers forward, 17 of them tied directly to Officers Davis and Lee. Baker's smile faded. "That's not possible." "It is," George said quietly. "Filed, buried, and forgotten. Until now." He pointed to the first page. "February 3rd, last year, a young man named Anthony Reed. Beaten during a traffic stop. No charges filed. No report forwarded to Internal Affairs." He turned another page. "June 17th, an elderly woman dragged from her car because she fit a description. Again, no follow-up. Then another. October 11th, dash cam footage erased before review." The air in the courtroom grew heavy. Davis's jaw tightened. Lee stared down at the table, his silence now louder than guilt. George looked at them both. "How many lives did you break before you reached mine?" Baker slammed his hand on the table. "You're out of line, Judge." George's eyes locked on him. "So was that arrest. And you defended it before hearing the truth." Judge Scott leaned forward. "Mr. Baker, I suggest you listen. The truth has a way of making itself heard, especially when the whole city is watching. Cameras flashed from the back of the room. Reporters scribbled every word. The once quiet courthouse had become a stage for justice itself. Davis finally spoke, his voice low. "You think you can ruin me? I was doing my job." George turned toward him. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to humiliate and harm." "You provoked us," Davis said, voice trembling with defiance. "You stood there, silent. That's not normal behavior." George nodded slowly. "You're right. It wasn't, because silence is power when words will only be twisted." The crowd murmured again. Some clapped quietly before being hushed by the bailiff. George took a deep breath. "This isn't just about me or these officers. It's about a system that lets silence hide abuse. A system that teaches men like you," he looked at Davis and Lee, "that a uniform means untouchable." Commissioner Roberts lowered his head slightly. The truth in those words cut deep because he had been part of that silence for too long. The hearing stretched on. Baker tried to defend the officers with legal jargon and excuses, but every time he spoke, George countered with evidence. Emails, dash cam logs, internal complaints that had been marked unsubstantiated without investigation. Each page he revealed made the room grow colder. Finally, Baker sighed. "What do you want, Judge? An apology? A press statement? You've already made your point." George stood slowly. "No, Mr. Baker, I don't want apologies. I want change." He walked to the center of the room, turning toward the mayor, the commissioner, and the journalist. "For years, citizens have been saying the same words I said that morning. I work here. I live here. I belong here." And for years, those words weren't enough. He paused, his voice quiet but firm. "It's time they mean something again." He opened another folder. "Starting today, Maple County will adopt full civilian oversight over police misconduct. No complaint will be buried, no file will vanish. Every patrol officer will wear a non-removable body camera, reviewed weekly by an independent panel." A ripple of surprise ran through the room. Baker's eyes widened. "You don't have the authority to—" George met his gaze. "Watch me." The mayor nodded slowly. "He does, actually. Under emergency judicial review, he has the authority to propose temporary binding reforms pending council approval." Baker sank into his chair, stunned. George continued, his tone steady. "Every officer will complete mandatory bias and de-escalation training. Refusal means termination. Cover-ups will be treated as crimes, not mistakes. And as for Officers Davis and Lee," he looked directly at them, "their badges will be suspended effective immediately, pending criminal charges." Gasps filled the room. Davis leapt up, red-faced. "You can't do this!" George's expression didn't change. "You did this, officer. I'm only naming it." The silence that followed was unlike any courtroom silence before. It wasn't fear, it was awakening. For the first time, the people inside that courthouse saw what justice looked like when it wore both humility and power. Outside, hundreds of citizens stood behind barricades, watching the live stream on a big screen in Liberty Plaza. Some cried, some shouted. Some simply stood still, holding their children close. Among them was Daniel Green, a boy no older than 12. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, he's the judge they arrested?" His mother, Karen Green, nodded with tears in her eyes. "Yes, baby. And he's standing for all of us now." Daniel looked back at the screen. "I want to be like him one day." Karen smiled weakly. "Then promise me you'll use your voice the way he used his silence." Back inside, the hearing adjourned. Officers escorted Davis and Lee out of the room. As they passed George, Davis muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this." George didn't respond. He just glanced at the cameras and said softly, "Justice doesn't regret truth." Reporters rushed forward. Flash after flash lit his face, but he didn't smile. He was tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of watching justice bend the wrong way. Commissioner Roberts approached him quietly. "Judge, I failed to stop this before it happened. I saw patterns too, and I stayed quiet. I won't anymore." George nodded. "Then start by speaking tomorrow under oath." Roberts's eyes filled with shame, then resolve. "You have my word." That night, as George sat alone in his office, the courthouse clock struck 10. Outside his window, Liberty Plaza was still filled with people chanting his name, demanding accountability. He looked down at his bruised wrists, the marks fading but still there, like a reminder carved into his skin. He whispered to himself, "Let them see what justice really looks like." For the first time in years, the courthouse lights stayed on past midnight. And for the first time, truth wasn't whispered behind closed doors, it was being written in public for everyone to see. Months passed. Maple County was no longer the same place. The courthouse that once stood as a silent wall between the people and power had become a doorway open, watched, and honest. Every morning, citizens lined the marble steps not to protest, but to observe. The new signs outside read "Public access to all hearings." Body camera footage from officers now streamed weekly on the county website. Inside, Chief Judge George Walker walked through the hallways, the same hallways where laughter once followed his humiliation. Now, the whispers were different. They carried respect. Clerks nodded. Security guards stood straighter. Even the new recruits looked at him with quiet awe. But George didn't let it change him. He still carried the same calm, the same slow stride, the same plain silver watch from his father. The marks on his wrists had faded, but he never covered them with sleeves. They were his reminder that dignity is not a gift, it's a choice. The trial of Officer Brian Davis began in late October. The courtroom was full. Cameras pointed toward the same man who once barked orders outside those marble doors. George didn't sit on the bench that day. He let another judge preside. But he sat quietly in the first row, watching. When Davis took the stand, his voice shook. "I was just doing my job," he repeated, over and over. But the videos, the documents, the testimonies told another story. People saw what George had lived through, the cruelty, the arrogance, the smirk. Every replay of that moment in the parking lot hit the crowd like a new wound. After 6 days, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in silence, the kind of silence that means something bigger than cheers. Davis's head dropped, his hands trembling as he was led away. From the corner, Officer Mark Lee watched quietly. He was next. He had already confessed his part, admitting that silence can wound as deeply as violence. When his trial began weeks later, he didn't fight it. He pleaded guilty. Outside the courthouse, Commissioner John Roberts stood before reporters. His tone was steady, remorseful. "For years, I looked the other way," he said. "Not anymore. From now on, we don't just punish bad officers, we prevent them." He announced new reforms drafted under George's leadership: random integrity tests, community review boards, and recorded accountability meetings for every arrest. "This isn't about revenge," Roberts said. "It's about rebuilding trust, one truth at a time." Later that evening, George found himself in his office, staring out at the fading sunset. The courthouse plaza below glowed with candles, hundreds of them placed by citizens to honor those wronged before him. Judge Barbara Scott knocked softly on the door. "You should go home, George. You haven't rested all week." He smiled faintly. "I'll rest when this city stops pretending that equality is optional." She chuckled gently. "You're turning speeches into laws now." "That's the only way they'll last," he replied. She nodded, then looked at the picture on his desk. George shaking hands with a group of students. "They adore you, you know." George's eyes softened. "They don't adore me. They adore what they finally believe in justice that looks like them." A week later, George received a letter at his office. It was handwritten in careful, uneven lines. Is greater than, Dear Judge Walker, my name is Daniel Green. I was the boy who told my mom I wanted to be like you. I'm studying hard now, and when I grow up, I want to sit in your courthouse, not because I want power, but because I want people to feel safe like you made us feel. Thank you for standing up when they tried to make you kneel. Your friend, Daniel. George read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it inside his briefcase, the same one that once lay on the ground beside his bloodied wrists. He ran his hand across the faint scratches on its surface, smiling softly. In December, Tom Reed, the young rookie who had watched everything unfold that morning, walked into George's office. He wore a simple suit now, not a uniform. Judge Walker, he said quietly, I came to say goodbye. I turned in my badge. George looked at him with curiosity. Why? Tom exhaled. Because that badge meant silence to me, and I don't want to be silent anymore. I'm applying to law school. Maybe one day I'll defend the kind of people we used to arrest. George nodded slowly, pride touching his eyes. Then make sure you don't just study the law, Tom. Study the people it forgets. Tom smiled. That's what you taught me. He left the room with a sense of purpose George could feel long after the door closed. Spring came early that year. The plaza trees bloomed white, and the courthouse walls seemed brighter. The air felt lighter not because injustice had vanished, but because it was finally being faced. One afternoon, George stood at the podium in Liberty Plaza, the same place where his name had been chanted in anger and hope. Now, he looked out at a sea of faces, students, elders, workers, officers, mothers, children, all gathered to hear his words. He took a deep breath. Months ago, I was handcuffed outside this courthouse. They said I didn't belong. But look at us, now. Look at this crowd. Look at what we've built. Justice doesn't live in titles or uniforms. It lives in how we treat the powerless when no one is watching. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. I forgive those officers, he continued, voice steady, not because they deserve it, but because anger builds walls. Forgiveness builds bridges, and bridges take us further. A tear rolled down the cheek of Mrs. Margaret Harris, one of the oldest community members present. She whispered, "We waited a long time for a man like him." When the speech ended, George stepped off the stage. Children ran forward to shake his hand. Among them was Daniel Green, taller now, holding a small notebook. He looked up at George with a shy smile. "I started writing about justice. Maybe one day, I'll write laws too." George smiled. "Then, promise me one thing. Daniel, never forget that justice starts with how you see people, not how they see you." Daniel nodded hard. "I promise." That night, as George left the courthouse, he paused at the steps. The same steps where he once knelt in handcuffs. The same stone where he was mocked and filmed. Now, the lights above him glowed warm. The wind carried laughter, not hatred. He looked up at the night sky and whispered to himself, "We didn't win a battle, we changed the story." And somewhere across the city, a young boy was reading about justice by candlelight, while the man who taught him its meaning walked quietly into the darkness, calm, humble, and finally free. Dear viewers, sometimes justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins when one person refuses to stay silent in the face of humiliation. George Walker's story reminds us that dignity has power, and truth always finds its way home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that change is possible. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today?